who's this man? Well, it's your grandpa. Well, where's he from? Well, it's the other side of the county. Oh, you mean he just lives on the other side of the county, and this is the first time I've seen him? And I remember a couple of times seeing him, so here's my grandmother. What I remember about my grandmother is that she would hold that garden out there in the morning. She'd take me with her to the garden to hold the garden. In the morning, it was the potato patch. Huge potato patch. And we'd work for a couple of hours in the morning. We'd go in and she would work all day long cleaning that big old 2-story house out on a gravel road, and it was so dusty back then. You know, cobwebs, and she was always battling the cobwebs and trying to clean the house. And she had the old linoleums that were really worn, but she tried to keep a clean house. And she worked hard and she cooked. As a matter of fact, I remember in the mornings I would hear her. She would be up humming hymns in the kitchen and cooking breakfast. And it would start at 5:30 as one of the uncles was out the door going to work, all the way down to the youngest ones, whenever they would finally, about 7 o'clock, be out the door to go to school. And she would make sure that there was gravy and biscuits. That was the standard fare every morning, gravy and biscuits. I understand you guys don't have gravy up this way, or at least they don't up towards Chicago. But we don't eat biscuits without gravy down there. And every morning it was gravy and biscuits, and she would make sure that those boys had it good. And those boys grew up, and she had a hard time with those boys. They were always wrapping a car around a tree. They were always drunk. I remember one night one of them heard a horrible, horrible noise, and I ran out the door and up the highway in the dark, little old kid about 8 years old, and dashed up there, and there was a car upside down on the side of the road, and come to find out, there was my uncle. It was my uncle. And there was another accident that he was in. 2 or 3 people got killed in that accident. And my grandmother lived with this all the time. And she was I remember I'd lay in bed at night when I spent the night with my grandmother, and I would hear her, and she would be begging them to do right, to live right, and they would cuss at her, and they would say awful things to her, treat her just awful. And she didn't have the help that she needed from that husband. But you know what I found out? Oh, by the way, and then in the evening we would be in the garden. We'd work the garden over. We'd have a peanut patch that would be this high. I mean, when we'd gather the peanuts, we'd stack them up and let them dry out there. Big old stack of peanuts. And what I learned all through this, I was kind of confused seeing all this, you know, growing up. But as an adult, I look back and I see one particular thing that really stands out in my memory about all this. That although my grandfather was never around, and although he despised the children, did not like being around the children, and as a matter of fact, those uncles to this day don't have anything good to say about their father. But you know what? After 30 years of being not divorced, because they would not divorce each other. They did not believe in that. They separated. And after 30 years of being separated, and it's like he was never around, the time came that my grandmother died. And guess what we did when we buried my grandmother? She told us before she was going, she said, "You take me up on the hill and you put me beside my husband." After everything that, I don't know if it's what he did or what he didn't do. There is a concoction of all of that in there. But she wanted to be beside him. I present to you tonight that my grandmother was not perfect, and my family certainly was not perfect, but I learned one thing out of that. I learned something that I had been, as a young pastor, telling a lot of people in marriage counseling through the years, that marriage is not a feeling, marriage is a commitment. Love is a commitment. You commit to somebody when you marry someone, and then all that time I was seeing it, but not realizing that my grandmother was doing this, that she was going to be an ultimate example for me in this situation. We must. What is a Christian home? Secondly, a Christian home is a place where love reigns. Where it reigns. And if the man of the home decides, I'm not going to be here, I'm going to go. I saw in my grandmother that she said, love's going to reign here anyway. I'm going to love these children even though they're breaking my heart wide open. I'm going to love my husband even though he's breaking my heart wide open. You know, and then I found out maybe where a little bit of that came from, because she used to, Well, she was raised by my great-grandfather, of course, that lived to be 102, and he came up from Wyatt, Missouri area about once a year and would spend a week or two with my grandmother. And he'd get out there and he would push the plow, and I'd try to help him push the plow. I was really more of a burden than a help because I was just hanging on. I was a little bitty whippersnapper. But there I'd try to help my great-grandfather in the garden and didn't hear much from him. A little old short guy, skinny guy, and just didn't say much of anything. But he had these big old clodhopper boots on that he'd put on first thing in the morning. I guess it was like his work boots. That's all he had done all his life. And when he was 100 years old, that's what he would still do. He'd get up, put those big old boots on, go out to the garden and work. Didn't hear anything from him all day. But you know what? He got hard of hearing. And when he went to bed at night, those last 2 or 3 years that he was at my grandmother's house, everybody in the house heard him praying for them. Because he didn't know that he was praying so loud that everybody else could hear him praying. But he was praying and he was calling them out by name. Now remember, he's 100 years old and he's praying for his children, which are like 70 years old. Now, you know, that reminds me now as I look back of Abraham. He still took control of his family and was a leader when he was an old man. Isaac was old enough to overpower Abraham when Abraham took him up to sacrifice him. And Abraham was an older man. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. So what is Abraham? 114, 15 years old at this point. And Abraham lived for God, and that was my great-grandfather. I didn't know much about him, but he had a heart of love for his children. And I began to realize through all the dysfunction that was in the family, I began to see there were some semblances of hope and some light that was there, because there were some people that realized that a Christian home, there should at least be love there. And it really comes down to relationships. And you know, I went to churches and, you know, you'd have all this formality that you'd go through church. And a lot of times as a child, I would see all the formality. You know, you had the penny margin, you had 3 songs of prayer, 2 more songs, and then you had specials. And then, you know, you usually go. But you know what really touched me was I would ride my bike down the street to Ikern. This little lady lived there who was in the church, and she would sit out on the porch swing, and I'd ride my bicycle up. And Sister Alice would always be sitting on that porch swing. I still see her today sitting there with this arm up on the chain and a leg sticking out over on this side. And she would be sitting there, and I would pull up, and the first thing she'd start doing is talking about the Lord. And it didn't take her very long in talking about the Lord until a tear would begin to flow down her face. Oh, yeah, and speaking of storms, I remember one time being at her house and she talked about the storm that night. She was a widow. She'd been alone for many, many years, but she wasn't alone. She knew the Lord. And I discovered through her that the Lord is not a formula. He's not a formula. I discovered through her that it was a very real, vibrant relationship, because she said, you know, I read that scripture just the other day about he rides upon the wings of the wind. And she said, last night that storm came through and it just kind of scared me at first. And she said, I thought of that scripture and I could just picture the Lord riding on the wings of the wind. And he was right here with me in this home last night. And I, as a young child, began to realize that God is real. And you know, this message isn't going anywhere where I thought it was going to go tonight. This is really a different message. Let me tell you something tonight. This is what our children are missing today. Because our children do not have relationships with older people. We have taken our children and segregated them and said, you get off here with people your own age, and you'll be better off if you can relate with people your own age. We don't care if you can relate with anyone else. But you just relate with people your own age, because if you can't relate with people your own age, people will talk about it and say you're a bunch of social misfits. Our children need relationships with parents. Relationships with grandparents. And this is a lie from the devil that says, well, you can't do anything about those grandchildren. They're not going to listen to you. You need to believe that God has put you in the position that you're in to say some things. And it might be the first few things you say, they're not going to listen to you. But you keep talking, and you know what? If it's not a formula, if it is a real relationship and they detect love in it, they will respond.